I'll have to leave maybe like 10 minutes.
We're very fortunate to have with us today Professor Candace Upton from University of Denver. She is just recently here in Denver, further away from Laramie, where she was teaching at the University of Wyoming for 4 years. So please join me in welcoming to our campus, Professor Upton.
Okay, my work is primarily in ethical theory and within that field virtue ethics and moral psychology, and then more particularly character traits. The last 30 years has shown a tremendous revival in virtue ethics, which relies centrally upon the notion of character traits. So that's really what I've been looking at. Of course, ancient Greek moral philosophy has Socrates and Plato as central proponents, and Aristotle as central proponents of virtue. But then that tradition dies down for hundreds and hundreds of years, and deontological and consequentialist, outcome-based and act-based approaches to ethics become more central. 30 years ago, people started questioning whether character traits didn't just somehow collapse into a deontological, outcome-based or act-based approach to ethics, whether there's maybe something distinctive about it that has something rich qualities attaching to both deontological and consequential approaches. And so within that whole 30-year revival, what I'm doing today is I'm arguing for a new account of character traits. This account of character traits is firmly cemented in Aristotle. There's roots also in Plato, possibly Socrates, hard to tell. It shows up clearly in Hume, it shows up in Kant, it shows up in Mill and Nietzsche, and then I can cite a whole long list. You can see under 1A a long list of this standard account of character traits. What I'm going to do is argue that that's incomplete, and that actually the theoretical virtue ethicists are theoretically committed to what intuitively and prima facie appear to be horribly counterintuitive, two kinds of horribly counterintuitive character traits. But I'm going to argue that once you see what the primary role of the character trait attribution is, these two new kinds of character traits radically enhance the normative capabilities of character trait attribution and thus virtue ethics. So here's the standard account of character. So standard account of character traits. I'm going to supplement that with two new kinds of character traits. Claim that the virtue ethicist is committed to those two kinds, but that really it just helps out the virtue ethics. That's the long run. That's sort of the narrow cases. Classical traits. Here's how I'm thinking of them. I think this is well substantiated in the literature. You possess a classical character trait C, just in case you're in C-relevant state of mind. So you've got certain beliefs, desires, processes of deliberation, maybe a strength of will. You're capable of identifying certain situations as requiring, say, just or honest or chaste behavior from you. This state of mind and Ischian behavior across the full range of normal situations that are relevant to the trait. So what I've got here, if everyone can see, this is here's classical account of character traits. This is I'm going to have this represent your state of mind. I just call it a trait relevant state of mind. Let's use justice as an example. A person who's classically just is going to have certain beliefs about what constitutes justice, generally, and in certain specific situations. They're going to have, say, the desire to exact justice, whether it be towards people they like or dislike, towards people who are affluent, people who are indigent, towards friends, neighbors, that sort of thing. So certain beliefs, certain kinds of desires, they might take a certain strength of will to actually behave justly towards people who you despise, people who you resent, people who you envy. Being just might involve certain processes of deliberation. You have to think certain ways, and you have to reason certain ways about just eliciting situations in order actually to have the right state of mind when your act issues, when your state of mind issues in an act of justice. So there's going to be a lot of different mental states. I think Aristotle's right. They're going to vary from agent to agent, and they're going to vary from situation to situation. But I'm just going to call this a just state of mind, or a classically character relevant state of mind. There's two things about this that I'm going to question. There's two truisms about this account of character traits. What the account says is you've got this stuff in your head. Two things about it. This state should issue in behavior, and that behavior should span across a complete range of different kinds of situations. It's not, it doesn't have to be that you've actually encountered the situation and behaved justly in them. Aristotle claims that. That's not, he's not representative of the literature there. But you have to behave, your state of mind has to issue in behavior towards, I already said this, friends, family. It should issue towards just behavior to people you like, be they friends or family, people you dislike, people you resent, people you envy. So your strength of will should enable you to overcome these kinds of emotions, these aversive states, in order to actually bring behavior into the world. That's the second of the truisms. The first is that behavior should issue across a complete range of different types of situations that are relevant to justice. So there might be certain kinds of situations that have nothing to do with justice, so those aren't going to matter for our purposes. But for the ones that are relevant to justice, you should, if you have your mental state has to be such that this counterfactual is true. If you were to encounter those situations, you would behave in each one of them. Second one is just that, so I call this the global constraint on classical traits. I've got denials of that under section number 2 there. So you've got your mental traits, they issue behavior across a broad base of situations. This is the globality condition, so it's global, the full spectrum. And it's got to issue in behavior. Your mental states have to actually issue in behavior. This one is so deeply, I've never seen this one questioned. There's a lot of literature out now about whether traits should be global, and a lot of studies done in social psychology about whether what appear to be traits issuing from character states in our heart really do stretch across global situations, or whether that's just some kind of deception in the way we perceive others' behavior. But the classical trait theorist is going to have behavior. Always it's going to be behavior. If there's some kind of fear, or again an envy or a disgust that clamps down over, say, your strength of will, such that it blocks your behaving justly, or makes you tell lies to people, or makes you have omissions of truth-telling to people in honesty relevant circumstances, they're going to deny that you're just, or deny that you're honest. You won't have that classical character trait. So those are the two truisms that I'm going to be disputing. I don't dispute the claim that these mental features need to hold at a general and sometimes a particular level to have a trait. I am going to dispute the globality claim. I'm going to claim it's not wide enough a constraint, and I'm going to dispute the behavior claim. I'm going to claim that there are character traits, that the central theoretical commitment of virtue ethics forces them into accepting that you can have, as long as you've got this, you can have this kind of justice, even if it issues only towards one kind of situation. Still, there are reasons they can't deny that you have to issue some kind of trait to a person who exhibits that kind of sophisticated psychology, we can say. And then I'm going to argue, so that's a denial of the global constraint. And then I'm going to deny that even for somebody who's got a psychology like this, such that they've got these mental features, they're in a, say, just or honest state of mind, even if there's one additional or multiple additional mental features, fears, disgust, envy, resentment, anything like that, that blocks this kind of behavior, such that there's the counterfactual that they would behave in these cases never holds. They never would behave in a just or honest or chaste way. Still, the central commitments of virtue ethics force you to accept that there's some kind of character trait we have to attribute to this person. Okay. Which seems a little bizarre, I realize it at the outset, because what's supposed to be really crucial about the classical account of character traits is that it directs human beings, people who have these kind of traits, such that you've got the mental features, you've got the behavior across a broad range of situations. It's going to enable you to flourish, whatever that's going to consist in. I mean, if your behavior your mental states would issue in just behavior only towards a very narrow circle of people, well, obviously you're going to encounter a lot of other people who aren't friends and family, and if you're not just behaving justly in those situations, you're not going to flourish. You have to flourish across you have to behave virtuously across every situation in order to flourish. And certainly, if you're behaving justly, honestly, chastely in no situations, you can't flourish. So that's something that initially seems really bizarre about my denying the globality and what I'm calling the dynamic constraint on character traits. Globality is across multiple situations. The dynamic constraint just means produces behavior. Okay? The two constraints really are tightly wedded. You got to produce behavior across a broad range or a complete range of situations counterfactually in order to be classically just. Okay. So what I'm arguing for, just quick definitions of what I'm arguing for, just in case there's anything to clarify. You possess a local trait as opposed to global, just in case you're in an L, local relevant state of mind, so you've got the very same mental states. I'm not disputing that. And it's just that it would issue behavior, or you're going to have this dynamic aspect of the trait geared behaviorally just toward one, or perhaps two or three, but certainly not the full of the situation. So to negate that, it will issue dynamically in behavior across some, but not the complete range of trait relevant situations. And you possess a static character trait. That's just, here's a local trait. You're in a just state of mind. You would behave justly towards your friends. So there's one situation where you've got the dynamism operating. Not that often you've got a static trait where you've just got a state of mind and you've got somebody who struggles. They have true beliefs about justice. They want to do justly. They actually have a strength of will. They're trying hard, but there's some kind of internal struggle. They find that they really, after some deliberation, after really working at it, they enjoy the feeling of having control over other people's lives. So in that kind of case, always that emotional state is going to preclude their behavior. That's just two example what I'm talking about. Okay, here's essentially what is going to commit the virtue ethicist to these absurd sounding character traits. It's what the primary function of it is, of a trait attribution really is. I think there's two things in here. One of them I'll mention, but I didn't put on the handout because I don't really want to defend it. But in the 30 years revival of virtue ethics, people have been trying to show how it could be distinct. When Kant talks about character traits, he just says, well, they're dispositions to do behavior in accord with, universalizability or respect for humanity or something. When Mill talks about character traits, all they are is dispositions to follow rules. So maybe he's ultimately some kind of character utilitarian or really utilitarian, which is fine. But those understandings of character traits, there's nothing distinct or interesting or substantive that they have to offer to either one of the two broadly demarcated types of ethical approach. But what two people have tried to do is argue that the only way, this is Gary Watson and Michael Sloat in very recent articles, they've tried to argue that it's this that's intrinsically valuable. This is a claim I don't want to defend in any strong way. This is something this is a paper that's forthcoming actually. But consequentialist or outcome-based approaches are just going to have the consequences of the act be the carrier of intrinsic value. The deontological approach generally is going to have the act itself, which is going to include something mental, namely your intention, being the carrier of intrinsic value. Some people are going to say that it's going to be this whole conglomeration of mental features that carries intrinsic value. I don't know how you can actually exact that depending upon whether you're an internalist or an externalist about mental states. That's going to partly determine the plausibility of that. But go ahead and suppose that these mental states are intrinsically valuable. And that's why it's a distinct approach. I know there's problems here. You might just say, well, the consequences we should try to produce in ourselves and others is that we have these kinds of mental states, so you can just have it conflated to an outcome-based approach. Similarly, you might do it for a deontological approach. But let's just assume for now, and I don't think I need this claim, so I'm not going to defend it too heartily. But assume that those mental states are intrinsically valuable. That's convenient for me because when in practically employing virtue ethics, you use character trait attributions, there's one thing that's normatively distinctive about saying that you're honest, or that you're just, or that you're virtuous. I'm just going to include all the positively valence character traits. And when we attribute to people these classical character traits, any type of character trait actually, we use them for a number of reasons. One is to inform. I might be concerned to let you know that the next door neighbor is very generous. Right? So there's an epistemic purpose right there, merely in the information yielding. Of course, I can put that to normative purposes. Maybe that's a good reason for me to go try to sell my Girl Scout cookies to the neighbor. There's one thing. Maybe you are. You could come up with a scenario if that's not too obviously normative. You can come up with a slightly different case, but we can certainly use information about people's character to refer back to the mental states. If I know that you're honest, I know that you've got the right set of mental states necessary for having honesty. It'd be a difficult thing to force actually to determine whether you're honest or not. But if I did have that information presented to me somehow, here's something I know about you. I know something else about you. If you're classically honest, I could count on you. Utterly count on you to behave honestly in any of these situations. And honesty might sometimes include what's appropriate to a situation. It might include disclosure. Sometimes it might include tactful white lies to people. That might be what's built into the trait honesty. But I know an awful lot about you. And because I know that, I can assess your action. If you actually do behave honestly, I can claim that it was a honest behavior, that it was a good one, because it issued from this whole bundle of facts about you. I can assess responsibility for that action, or responsibility in general for being a good or bad person, because it takes strength and willpower and quite a bit of work to develop and maintain that set of mental features. So there's an awful lot of important use to which I could put on information, but it's not intrinsically normative. Merely informing people. We can predict behavior, obviously, as I've already said. If I know that you're honest, I can predict that in this situation, that you'll be honest to people that you dislike, because that's what an honest person does, and I know you've got this stuff in here. I can reasonably predict that you'll buy my Girl Scout cookies again, if I know that you're a generous person, because that's what generous people do. Generous people have certain beliefs about why charity is necessary towards other, about the justice and injustice of the distribution of original goods that we've all been distributed. And so, because the attribution honesty tells me so much about you, I can make some pretty informative and pretty useful predictions. Informative predictions in that they inform what's reasonable response to you and reasonable behavior towards you. And they can explain, of course, if I want to explain why you support public radio, well, I might refer back to your generosity. So seeing that your act is tied back to all these states, that provides an explanation. Some people say that character and dispositional and general explanations are empty. Why did so-and-so tell the truth? Because they're honest, but that's what honest people do. So some people think there's a kind of uninformative circularity that's going on there, but because explanations of behavior in terms of character traits refer back to these mental states, I think we get really robust, informative explanations. Why did priests fall? We might wonder, you might appeal back to, as an explanation, back to the mental states of the people living at the time, the greed, for example, of people, and the lack of dishonesty and distrust amongst people might provide an explanation as to historical events, and specific current events for people, obviously. But with the predictive and explanatory functions of character trait attribution, again, they're either epistemic, be they intrinsically or instrumentally epistemic, or else their only purpose is to engage. It is to direct us towards moral behavior or moral responses towards people. They don't in themselves do anything normative. I think that attributing merit to people is the one thing to which that the character trait attribution has on its side as being intrinsically normative. I think you're an honest person, well, that attribution of honesty, we're thinking classical honesty right now, that attribution of classical honesty to you, it's not just informing me about something, it's not only something that enables me to predict your behavior, it's not only something that enables me to refer back to your mental states and explain your behavior in terms of that, but it also just tells me, like, look, here's somebody who's good in this particular kind of way. There's a very direct connection. And I may be using instrumentally and intrinsically non-standardly here, but I think that there's a really tight connection between saying somebody's just and that those intrinsically valuable states of being. I call it reflecting the desert thing. You might want to call this relation between the attribution and the intrinsic value of these mental states. It reflects desert. It gives credit that somebody is due for their having developed or maintained these hard to develop and maintain mental states. But I clearly also throughout the literature, this is one thing that character trait attributions are supposed to do. They're supposed to evaluate people, to morally assess them, and also actions and responsibility. But primarily, there should be a fit between the trait that you attribute to somebody and what's going on between them mentally. So, the claim about intrinsic value in conjunction with what should be the proper fit between attribution and your mind, basically the ground of your mental state, that's what's going to commit the classical virtue theorist to the crazy sounding two kinds of traits that I'm going to defend, the local trait and the static trait. And I do this just by looking at two cases, and I think there are people like this in the world, so I don't think there's anything, I guess, science fiction-y about the cases I'm going to present that would make us think that they're not relevant to our characterological situation. But here's Aaron. Aaron was raised under good parents. He has, let's say, for charity's sake, true beliefs about what constitutes justice. It's a very difficult concept to work with as an example, but just because there's so many different ways of understanding justice, but he's got true beliefs about what's just in a general way, and applied to specific situations. He has true beliefs about justice. So he's got also beliefs about justice. He's got the perceptual capacity. When he gets into a situation, he can identify pretty quickly, that person's being done an injustice, that it needs to be righted. So he's got perceptual capacities. He desires to do just acts towards other people when the burden's upon him to do so. It's sometimes a pain to have to do that, and so he knows though that it's something he should do, and so he's worked to develop a strength of will to be. He's committed to doing just acts. He really does care about other people and seeing right exacted in their lives. And there's going to be processes of deliberation. Maybe you have to think a certain way. Maybe there are certain things you have to hate about the world, or maybe you have to hate injustice. There might be other things going on in his life to bring about certain different kinds of mental states. But let's say that he's got a just state of mind. Again, these could differ for different people, but at a general level, we can certainly accept that as being the case. There's people who really do care, really do believe, really do try hard to bring about justice in the world, even when it's difficult to do so. I've already explained Aaron's situation to you. Classical traits. And here's Aaron's trait. Okay, so he's got the very same mental features. He was very poor growing up and had to work hard for everything that he now has in his life. We know people like this. And he learned to develop a very deep resentment of people who are affluent, who are given things that he had to work for, partly because they seem to have this attitude, he thinks. And he's partly envious, partly resentful. But all the things he had to struggle to get into his life, other people were just hand-delivered, spoon-fed. So he really does care, but he has to struggle. He encounters situations where affluent people are done injustices, and he realizes that he should actually behave well towards them, behave justly towards them. But he goes through, he struggles, and his envy, his resentment win over. So if his envy and resentment were gone, if he had had a different kind of background that hadn't produced these mental features in him, his trait would be dynamic and it would be global. It would like range across all these different situations, which include justice towards people who are affluent. But instead, he does have these mental features. And so, what does he do when a rich person is deserving justice? He lets it go. He does struggle, but he lets it go. When it's people who he identifies with and who he really realizes need his help, and towards whom he has no resentment because he identifies with their history and their having had to work so hard, he goes ahead and puts himself into the just behavior. So, what we've got, this is something extramental, but he's got what's intrinsically valuable. So, for that reason, I think there's no denying that if character traits are intrinsically valuable, and the sole normative function of attributing a character trait is to attach or to that value or to reflect that value, then you've got to attribute some kind of character trait to him, or there's got to be some system of delivering this credit that he's due. Despite this, and I don't want to say, oh, he's classically just, because that's misleading, obviously, even though he does possess all the intrinsically good stuff. Clearly, there's something that's bad here. These features might count as the ground or the base of a bad, negatively valence character trait. That might be so. But whether they are or not, clearly they subtract from the credit that he does deserve. So you might say, to put this ridiculously, he 10 points for intrinsic value for possessing, but then these subtract too. So in a way, so the basic point, I don't know if the goodness or badness of these states is cardinal or ordinal, or if you can subtract them all. I think we have an intuitive understanding of what's going on here, though. The badness of these and the badness of the fact that they preclude behavior across this other range of situations subtracts from the value or the credit he deserves for having these mental features. And so, what I suggest is attributing to Aaron a rather messy looking name, but for the trait we're going to give him. I think that's the form of justice we should attribute to Aaron. This attaches to this. This indicates, of course, the range of situations across which he would behave justly, across which the mental features are dynamic, and attaching to this part of the predicate, is the understanding or inference, if you want, that there's some kind of additional mental feature that's precluding this behavior. Thus, the credit he gets for this is diminished by those features. So what we have is a way of, I don't think it's even reasonable to deny that he deserves some credit. There might be in some cases, but not this way. He deserves some credit because he's worked to gain these states, and they're intrinsically valuable. So we have to give him some credit. And here's how, what I'm calling the extra classical account. Extra classical, you see what I call that. Extra classical account. So that's, this is how we do it. Let me go quickly through the case of Baron, who is different from Aaron in only one way. Exactly the same set of mental features relevant to justice. They had an identical upbringing. Total resentment, but there's one additional. So he's got the envy, he's got the resentment, and he's got, let's say, one additional emotional state. You might want to, I described this one earlier, you might want to say that it's a feeling of satisfaction for having control over other moral factors of other people's lives. It sounds kind of sick, and maybe that's going to diminish the moral credit he has earned for these states significantly. But overall, the thing's basically gonna be the same. This gives us a local trait, which I've defined up in section 2. This gives us a static trait. There's no behavior that's gonna issue from this intrinsic value at all because of these precluding factors. But yet he still deserves credit, though it's diminished more so than for Aaron. How are we gonna attribute credit? He's statically just. A better way to, a more informative way to do it, one that might more carefully attach to the credit which we need to assess him, is just to say, it's to pick out what are the blocking factors in virtue of which the trait is static. There's something that's really interesting there's a kind of bizarreness that people always claim about thinking of just this as a character trait. When you've got like a ground for a disposition and something that masks that behavior, in character traits it seems horribly, as I've said, horribly counterintuitive to think of there being a trait there at all. But it is interesting to notice the comparison between the way we think of traits sort of intuitively and with a sort of conventional understanding of metaphysics. Here's a vase. And normally it's got a sort of ground for its fragility. Right? So it's a certain lattice like microstructural complex, right, of the molecules within. And so that's comparable in a way to the intrinsically valuable mental features of Aaron and Baron. But in classical metaphysics, and I think pre-scientifically and very intuitively, we think that even if there's some blocking factor, behavior blocking factor attaching to the vase, for example, it's coated, this is sort of a bold example, it's coated in thick rubber. Even if you've got a behavior that blocks, an outside factor that blocks behavior, especially if it attaches to the object that has a disposition, even though if you were to drop this on cement, it wouldn't break, it wouldn't display its characteristic behavior, people still want to say that that has the disposition. Whereas with character traits, if there are factors that block the behavior, people want to say there's no disposition or no character trait present. It's kind of interesting. I gather for reasons having to do with human flourishing, ethical character traits are supposed to produce flourishing, and if there's no behavior that can't produce flourishing. But because of this, this desert function of trait attribution, the virtue theorist is deductively committed to endorsing these kinds of traits. And of course, there's going to be no implication whatsoever that behavior is going to come across in the full range here, or that it's going to come across at all. And the traits are distinct. This is a denial of global justice, classically conceived. This is a denial of dynamic justice. You can't be both locally and statically just at the same time, obviously, because if you're statically just, you've got a just state of mind, but there's no behavior. Here there is at least some behavior, so you can't, same person at the same time in the same way, can't be both statically and locally just. But, okay, so here's my two cases, and here's how my extra classical account of character traits is going to deliver moral credit, is going to have that attribution attached directly to what's intrinsically valuable about character in the first place. Okay, and all that's left is to show that the way that classical character traits classically conceived can't, except very imprecisely with the character trait attribution, have that proper fit between value and trait. So we've got under 4A1 classical resources for reflecting desert or for providing some kind of moral assessment. You can attribute justice to either one of these. If you attribute justice here, obviously it's misleading in a number of different ways, and in terms of providing information and explanation, that's going to lead us off track. I mean, if we were to call Aaron classically just, well, that obviously entails that he's dynamic across all situations, that he's got a global trait, which is false, which is going to lead you into false predictions, which is going to lead you morally astray if you judge your behavior based on those kind of predictions. But this is about fit between attribution and intrinsic value of character of these states. And that's saying too much, it's providing too much credit. So we've got this huge umbrella of credit with the attribution just, but Aaron only deserves a little umbrella because it's diminished by these precluding states. So, classical account isn't doing very much. I mean, it's doing way, way too much. In fact, when it attributes justice simpliciter to Aaron, if it tries to say it's not just, well, it's not doing anything at all for him. He has developed those states, and it's difficult. It's a real struggle to develop those states. And so it should be giving him something, but to deny justice altogether, to deny that attribution altogether, it doesn't have a way to have a fit between trait attribution and intrinsic value. This is all assuming, of course, that you have to have your traits reflect value. You could have some other kind of non-trait attribution reflect value, but I'll get to that. So some variant of the trait justice doesn't work to attribute it, that's too much, doesn't work to deny it, that's too little. So there's not proper fit between either one of those attributions and the intrinsic value of his mental life. Partial justice, or some degree of justice. Maybe you'd say he's 20% just or something like that. That gets closer, but if you were to say, first of all, that Aaron is partially just, that's consistent with his being just in one situation. It's consistent with his being just in two situations. It's consistent with his being just across three kinds of situations. So again, we don't have any really careful fit that enables us to see really what's Aaron, of what is Aaron meritorious. This gets it all. Also, if you have two kinds of situation across one of which it's harder to be just, say it's a lot harder to be just towards indigents in Aaron's case. Suppose that, because he fears strangers and he doesn't want to interact with them at all. Let's just suppose that. But but still he respects them because they've had to work. His family he respects because they've had to work, and he's not jealous or anything of that. But he doesn't have to put himself out quite so much to behave justly toward his family because he feels comfortable with them. Well, then behaving justly in this kind of situation is going to take more out of him morally speaking, and so he's going to deserve more credit for that. And what we want is for the attribution to fit what's morally valuable about Aaron. And by giving this kind of attaching this kind of predicate to him, you get exactly that. So if it's harder for him to be indigent just than to be family just, that's reflected in the attribution. So that's why partially just isn't going to fit the bill, because different kinds of situations can take more out of us morally speaking. Okay. And you might want to say, okay, well there's only 10 kinds, 6 kinds of situations across which Aaron could be just. Suppose that this full range I've marked out here is limited. There's only 10 kinds of situations, or 6 here, sorry. 6 kinds of situations. You might want to say, I'll do 10 so I can figure this out. So that'll be your one too. Okay, 10 kinds of situations across which you can be just, and he would be just across only 2. So you might say 20% justice. But then, again, we don't know which kinds of situation that is across which he's just, and you have this problem of of merit attaching more or less weightily to different kinds of situations across which you can behave justly, simply because they take more out of you to actually propel you into behavior. So saying that he's 20% just isn't going to do the job either, though it does, I think, maybe get closer. It's at least not attributing too much or too little, but we can be an awful lot more precise and have a perfect fit between attribution and value. So that's 2 attempts for the classical accounts to attribute justice to Aaron. And that's where you got to fit between trait attribution and trait. You can try using something distinct from a trait attribution to get at that moral credit. You might just want to say, well, he's not just, so deny the trait attribution altogether, but these acts are just. So he wouldn't behave, we know that, his dynamically indexed only towards 2 kinds of situations. But it's when he actually behaves justly towards poor people who he doesn't resent, that those acts are good. Those are good acts of justice, and same for his family. I don't think that's a false claim, but I don't think that it, again, I think it mislocates the credit, and I don't, when it mislocates, I don't think it gives enough credit, really. Okay, so first it mislocates it. He's worked hard to develop these states. So by just saying he's not just, but his acts are, is denying him this, right? Especially where you, in a Aristotelian spirit, you want your acts to issue from your character. They're from your firmly rooted character. This stuff's firmly rooted in Aaron, and that's why he, for having these states, deserves credit, and not just the stuff he does. Besides, these are counterfactual constraints. You don't, except in Aristotle, you don't, and maybe Brand, you don't ever have to actually behave justly towards indigent. It's just that, given your state of mind, if you were to, then you would have the trait. But as long as he's got this, and he would, well, that counterfactual could be true of him, but that's consistent with his not ever behaving justly towards indigent people, or his ever behaving justly towards his family, because maybe the situation just never arises. He's got the perceptual capacity, so he can always identify, right, when he needs to be just to people. It just never comes up. So he might even not be exhibited just behavior in his entire history. So there'd be nothing on this third suggestion for the classical theorist. There's nothing to which you can attribute his moral credit. So under that circumstance, you end up delivering significantly less than he merits because there's nowhere to put it. I think you've got to put it here. You can put it here additionally, but primarily it needs to be here because that's the locus of intrinsic value, given this assumption, which I promise to defend in the future. Or you can just deny justice altogether and deem his state of mind valuable, which is, I mean, and I think this is probably the best approach, but, so this is valuable, but he doesn't have this state of mind. It's a little bit bizarre for two reasons. One, I mean, this doesn't follow from this principle, but I mean, if you're going to deliver credit for these traits, for these features, given that they are dynamic across a broad range, it's at least consistent with that. I'm not claiming there's an entailment relationship here, but it's consistent with that you give credit for the range of situations across which they would counterfactually issue a behavior. But it's still going to be moral credit going here. So I don't see the point. Given that, it seems like you should be using a character trait attribution to parallel the moral credit of Aaron here. And second, I mean, just for the sake of theoretical unity, traits morally valuable, the mental states are morally valuable, but you're going to deny them a trait attribution because, okay, which is understandable. But look, there's a nice streamlined theoretical way of having your intrinsic value, having your trait attribution, and not having to bring in other kinds of theoretically ad hoc terminology in order to account for what he deserves, which would be the thing you would be doing with saying, he's not just, but he's, he tried hard, maybe, if you want to refer to this struggle, or he's got true beliefs about justice and he's pretty good at picking up when people, deserve just behavior. He's good at that stuff, but he's not just. That's not illicit at all, I think, especially in light of this assumption that I've sort of overtly made. But there's just a better way to do it, a more unified way to do it. I do think that, if any, is the where a hole may lie in my argument, but since there is a way to have that fit between value and attribution, you might as well do it instead of coming at it externally. Yeah, you could say, as ways of deeming Aaron's under 4AD, 4A1D, as ways of deeming him, he tried really hard, or he came close but failed. These are all daily locutions we use to express something like this, but there's a theoretical way to do it that comes, that's got all of these kind of, the commitments of intrinsic value and the fit, that's got it built into it. So I think that's probably for those reasons, for those theoretical reasons, the better way to do it, not to approach attributing value from these non-trait, non-characterological sources. Okay. So that's Aaron's case. Barron's case gets a little bizarre. That's my argument. There are people like this, classical traits. If you're going to have your trait attribution connect right up to what they deserve, you can't do that classically. You have to endorse these local traits in order to do that, and they work very, very nicely, given the diversity of psychology that people display. If we're going to actually account for them, not only to be able to use our classical traits to refer to Aristotle's ideal person. So that's the argument. The local or extra classical account that endorses local traits can have this fit, and the classical account cannot. Barron's case isn't radically different. Well, there's no behavior. Okay. Attribute, or if you deny justice, you wouldn't want to attribute justice. That seems a little bizarre. There's too many implications that are given there. There's way too much credit. It doesn't seem like you want to deny that he has the trait altogether, because this is really what's central to the trait. That's the ground of it, and that's what's firm. And, that's what you're largely what you're responsible for building up and keeping. And that's hard to do, and they're intrinsically valuable. So to deny justice is a bit off kilter as well. There's one situation in which I think you might be able to do that by attributing partial justice. Again, you don't get it this, you don't get that value is depleted by these extrinsic mental blocking factors. There aren't, by definition of the case, any acts to which you can attribute justice. So 3 isn't going to work. D, for the same reason as in Aaron's case, I don't think D is very successful. One thing, there's one kind of circumstance under which you might want to deny justice altogether, but that would be a distinct case. If you've got so many states of envy and resentment and, let's say, hatred and fear and disgust towards other human beings, that those are what's consistently blocking out his just behavior. If there's so many of them and their intensity is so great, they might altogether cancel out. Like if those are +10, they might probably cancel out the merit he deserves for that. I think that's the only circumstance under which you want to deny justice altogether. Okay. And, sorry, I'm trying to wrap up quickly, sorry. Here's how it's an improvement upon virtue ethics. Because you can fit in 1 or 2 or 3 kinds of situation across which somebody's behavior is dynamic, well, there might be some people in existence who just do behave justly or would behave justly across the full range. So, for that reason, because you can have different numbers of situation kinds across which your behavior, which your trait issues and behavior, well, it might just issue in all the whole spectrum. Counterfactually issue in the whole spectrum of behavior. So there's your classical justice. But it's subsumed under this extra classical account. That's why I call it extra classical, because we can account for people like this. We can describe, assess, et cetera, people who are actually in the situation. But using the same little bit of theory unified at the top, we can account for these people as well. Have a fit and account for these people as well, and have a fit between attribution value. So people I say, oh, this is bizarre, it doesn't give you any, there's not any normative force to it, there's nobody, no phronimos, right? No ideal moral agent. No, if you like them, what would Jesus do? There's nobody who's morally perfect to whom you can look for advice, or who you can pretend you are if you're in a certain difficult situation and having difficulty with deliberation. But there is, just because you've got this full spectrum justice that this account can subsume. So you want somebody to be perfect, towards whom you have to be perfect. That's this person. That is the classically just person. But that we can account for that. The way we can account for that is subsumed by the theoretical commitments of the broader theory that gives you more fine-grained trait attributions. And you can better inform, predict, and explain. You might have somebody who would only behave honestly towards poor people, for example, and towards their family, Well, if you were to say they're just honest, simpliciter, or they're classically honest, it's not very informative. That can be horribly misleading when you're trying to gauge your own behavior, assess responsibility for a person or for action, because there's going to be the entailment that there's behavior across the full spectrum of situations, and there just isn't. So it's also, for the same reasons, going to provide misleading criticisms and explanations. But it's really the fit between attribution and trait that is that I think is deductively driving this argument towards these kind of traits. But it really just puts virtue ethicists in a much, much better position to figure out what's going on, to account for what's going on psychologically in interesting and complex human beings. So that's my work right now on this one paper on character traits. Thanks.
Thank you.
I come at the ethics of character through Aristotle. You need some qualifications about Aristotle's view. But one thing that I was struck by is that the language of state of mind seems importantly different from the language of disposition. And that, for example, in Barron's case, and in Aaron's case too, probably, Aristotle would not want to look at the person as exemplifying justice or some other virtue, because there really is a problem with its being cashed out in terms of action. And it's the connection between the language of disposition and actions that we deem to be just or honest or what have you, that seems preferable to the language of state of mind, which tends toward a kind of what almost seems like an over-psychologizing of virtue assessment. Does this seem?
Well, I've shifted terminology primarily because of this. And even if you're going to deny that this state of mind is intrinsically valuable, I don't think it's plausible to deny that this person and these all three deserve some kind of credit for what they've built up, which is significant. There is, that's partly why I'm shifting terminology. I can't just stipulate, I'm using disposition this way and character this way, so I'm divorcing the concept of disposition or trait from behavior, which I'm obviously doing. But there's a reason for having this, it's a kind of spectrum of use of these modal terms of trait or disposition and state of mind. Any disposition is going to have something grounding it. To take the vase, it's got something grounding it, which is going to be the lattice-like structure of the micro, comparable to that. And so I think we've got to pick apart the different parts of the disposition to see what's really operating with the character trait and with the disposition. I've got other stuff on that. But that's why I do that. When a lot of people will say about character traits, they're just dispositions to behave. Some people say in accord with certain kinds of rules, to produce certain kinds of acts. But what's typically understood there is that there's a black box, right? So you're just a functional machine. You encounter certain kinds of situations. You produce certain kind of behaviors. That's one concept of a disposition, where it doesn't matter what's inside, whether you're acting out of malice or trying to impress people, as long as you tell the truth in the appropriate situations. That kind of terminology, that's one way of understanding this terminology that may be more in line with what you're thinking. And I'm shifting over terminology of disposition and character trait in particular to require certain features to be present here. And it's because of those features and their intrinsic value, and just because they can issue across different states, that I'm thinking of this a kind of melding where you've got to make reference to what's going on here in order to exact this purpose of attribution.
But I wonder if I could see a heuristic value in saying, well, we want to understand why the honest person acts the way she does, then we need to find out what beliefs she has, how her deliberations go, and that sort of thing. When you speak of grounding, that seems to almost imply too much. That it seems to me that we could make perfect sense of the moral credit we give to honest individuals without being committed to an honest individual having very definite beliefs or desires. Rather than, that isn't to say that maybe there's a middle position between the black box and the particular constituents of the state of mind that would be viewed as grounding.
Is it that we can't specify what they're going to be in a particular situation? Or we might not metaphysically, there might not be a fact about whether we have a particular belief, desire, deliberative process or something like that in a particular situation?
No, I mean, I think that oftentimes our actions, we could specify certain beliefs, but it would be, in a sense, ex post facto. I mean, in order to do the honest thing, you don't actually have to have in your head or in mind the relevant sorts of beliefs or desires. I'm putting that out as a possibility.
I agree with that. In order to do the honest thing, you may not need all that stuff inside. If it's epistemically and metaphysically specifiable and specified and specific. But that's honest behavior, right? And this is interesting that you press on this, because I haven't seen anybody in a lot of literature question whether you actually need to have this. There's argument about what the specific things are, and people add things like strength of will and well, you have to reason a certain way about these things and have certain capacities, but I haven't seen anyone really press them. I guess the last way you articulated the concern was that to behave honestly, you needn't have these states. And I don't know how to make sense of that. I mean, you could have behavior that's physically describable as truth-telling behavior, given the environment and how you interpret it and such. But I don't know what would make it count normatively as honest behavior if it wasn't coming from here. Like, ultimately, it might have been your intention to deceive, but you were just not bright enough to get that out, or to get that effective, maybe. And so, because it was issued from an intent to deceive, we wouldn't call that honest behavior. So, the mere output, like satisfying the description, isn't gonna be enough to get you the character trait, which is why that's not really an argument on my part. I'm appealing to intuition, but I think that's why we've got to go back to the mental features.
Rob comes at it from Aristotle, I'm coming out through Plato. It seems to me that this is a tremendously helpful and useful act of virtue-free as description. And one way I think it's tremendously useful as description is that it enables us to say, there's something that Plato is really praiseworthy for in his effort to try to get Socrates out of jail. But he's missing it in certain other areas. He's local and not global. Anyway, what worries me about this is that I think it may preclude a normative virtue theory. It's a description that precludes a normative, in that there seems to be no way of being able to effectively describe the difference between Crito, who is, yes, locally just, and in fact you could say instead of indigent and family, friends and family just, and no way to distinguish that between someone like Meno, Gorgias, or Meletus, who are also friend and family just because they think that virtue is to benefit your friends and harm your enemies. Clearly there's a difference between Crito, who should be more praiseworthy, and Meletus. And maybe saying that Aaron is mature, or more mature, and Baron is less mature, and the classical trait is the most mature, brings the normative component in. The problem I have with this is if you say emulate, in order to emulate Aaron, if Aaron is it's worthy to be emulated, is that not only in having emulated his character in terms of BP, DWP, we also have to add envy and resentment in order to be him. And of course that becomes, again, the question Rob is asking to some extent.
There's going to be, I don't know how to do this. This is a big problem, and this is what I think a central problem that a lot of people are now trying to answer in books that are coming out on character traits, and I think there's a lot of arbitrariness to it. So I'm not going to claim to be able to do this here, obviously, but the claims, the lower level claims can be, these are intrinsically valuable, these are intrinsically valuable. The bigger question people try to answer, just stipulatively, I think, is how do you distinguish which dispositions towards action count as negatively valenced and which count as positively valenced, right? Well, the ones that promote human flourishing, that obviously doesn't help. You can come up with the counter examples, but these intrinsically valuable, intrinsically disvaluable, whether they're part of the base of another character trait or a bad character trait or not. So that's the sense in which he's morally emulable. We want this stuff. Talk to him, interact with him, see how he interacts with others. Try to develop this stuff. Try not to have this stuff. So we've got the even if there's no actual instantiation of this one, clearly there's a kind of paradigm here we set up. There's a partial paradigm here. Get these things, don't get these things. There's a partial paradigm here as well.
The difference between Meletus and Gorgias and Meno and Crito is not the difference between Aaron and Baron, because I think actually they can be described equally as friend and family just from this descriptive point of view. So it becomes difficult to see why one should not emulate Meletus as opposed to emulate Crito. Clearly one promotes human flourishing only if you buy into a much greater project than the other.
I need more details about the two, I think. They could both accurately be described as locally just.
Yeah, perhaps maybe the reason Crito fails in this moment is because of his love for Socrates. Meletus or Meno would never have that kind of thing get in the way of their self-interest or something. Yeah.
So if they both count as some version of locally just, they both have to have the same things here. And if they're actually behaving differently, it's going to be, there could be two reasons, because of different blocking factors, or because just, it could be historical circumstances of their own situation, or something distinct about the situations they get themselves into, such that consistent with what Aristotle says, justice is different for people in different situations, dependent upon your station, your relations, and so on. Those are two reasons why. So we might want to count both of them as locally just, but to get an attachment between attribution and what they're deserving of, we might tailor these differently, or we might even go into this predicate an inclusion of the blocking factors. It might be worse to be blocked by envy than to be blocked by resentment, for example. So if we were to include blocked by or envy blocked, indigent and family just, we have a much richer, it's you know, you can foresee how this could become ridiculously long predicate, fine. It's theoretically unified, but I think that's the way in which they're both locally just.
And one is more worthy of emulating than another, based on human flourishing.
Based on what's in here and what's out here doing the blocking. Oh, okay.
But your talk was really clear and learned a lot from it, and so this is a question that sort of, I think, mucks this stuff up. Maybe you could just comb through it for me. I think it's familiar to most of us that family obligations of justice can trump justice to strangers. And so I'm wondering, is that disposition that most of us have to place family ahead of strangers, would you call that a behavior blocking emotional state? And if you would, let me just give you a second. And if you would, does that mean that anyone with a hierarchical sense of justice is incapable of classical justice?
I don't think so. I've been trying to abstract away from considerations like that, because what you might want to say is the reason that Aaron is just only towards these two groups. That's because unity of virtues. When you've got justice operating, and for example, you can do this with justice towards different people. I'm going to use honesty. If I'm unclear, press me. You can have your justice operating in a situation and your honesty operating in a situation, or some other trait operating. And sometimes proper operation just means trumping the other one. That doesn't mean that if the justice gets trumped, you're acting unjustly. It's just that behavior overall considered all the virtues have to be operating. You have to have a completely virtuous state of mind. You have to have all the mental features relevant to all the virtues, whatever those are. And sometimes that works with justice in different situations. So you've got, as you're describing, family justice trumping friend justice. That doesn't mean you've done something wrong or that you're not friend justice. It just means that given the way these justice operates towards two different kinds of situations, sometimes there's a trump. So I'm thinking of cases in which you should behave justly towards friends, but you don't because you resent them, not because your obligations towards family are operating in your behavior in a case like that.
So it's not an emotional blocking state. I think thinking maybe just to switch the example a little bit, thinking about how the sort of the duties of patriotism seem to trump justice to most of the world, and it's not just on occasion after it's through a course of entire 100, 200 years. It could happen. I got a problem with that. I got a big problem with that. But I can't figure out how to argue with people who are, in a sense, arguing for virtuous actions towards their country in a habitual way that excludes, for the long run, is systematically excluding justice to, say, other countries. It's the same example exactly.
One thing might just be they don't possess this, or more if that, so I'm not misleading. They don't have this. They've got false beliefs about what counts as justice towards Duda in a specific situation. So that might be one way of accounting for it. You sound like that's the view you might actually hold, that people are wrong about this. They have beliefs that patriotic justice trumps everything else, or justice to their own country. And
Yeah.
it simply doesn't. They're wrong about that.
Yeah, but it sounds like in certain situations, you were saying just before that it's proper for family justice to trump stranger justice, and then the question becomes, how habitual does it have to be for it to actually be an argument against the fact that they possess the state at all, rather than just saying, well, I trumped family justice trumped stranger justice for the first half of the year, and then the second half of the year, stranger justice made a comeback, and so obviously I'm classically just because the other side came back.
You could have a habitual friend justice from November to May.
Yeah, right. You can mark your
They
calendar.
can be funnily indexed, yeah.
Right.
You said something about habitualness being sort of the mark of the concern, the thing that's going to help you to distinguish whether you've got a trait operating appropriately or not. This is all going to hold independent of actual behavior because these are counterfactual claims. So and they require only that you've never stumbled into a certain kind of situation. There's a kind of, sorry, I know there's some more questions. There's a kind of disparity between the way we treat justice eliciting situations, like you see your little brother taking your little sister's doll or something like that, and the way we see emotional factors blocking behavior. I mean, if you were never to encounter your brother and sister fighting, that particular justice-related situation simply wouldn't arise. Behavior would never issue. But and you're not responsible for that. You might say on the one hand, so it doesn't matter. But also, I mean, you might have factors in your head such that when you do encounter this, if you're not responsible for these factors, they're going to block behavior. So in neither case are you going to get the just behavior. And in neither case are you responsible for the causal crux that precludes that behavior. But in the one case, we want to say you've done something wrong. In the second case, and in the first case, we want to say, oh, it's perfectly okay. You just never found them fighting over the doll or whatever. It's kind of interesting. That's why I think it's so important to do an analysis of dispositions and a parallel over to character traits, so that you see that there are justice or trait relevant situations. There's behavior. There's what's going on in your head. I could put behavior this way, and there's different situations. When you take into account those at least three different components of the character trait, you see that there's maybe a lot of inconsistent beliefs that we have about in how we treat them, at least. That's one example. Maybe the example of the vase, having behavior precluding factors and us thinking that it still does have the disposition, but yet when we have behavior precluding factors on a character trait, we don't have the disposition. That's maybe a disparity in the way that we think about these things, and that only arises once you do an analysis of character traits, dispositions into their components. So I hope that answers
Right.
with some instruction. Naomi, you had.
I was just, this is something that occurred to me while you were talking with the Miletus versus Aaron case. I think it might clarify it. Because you don't really want to compare on your account Aaron to Barron. You're comparing Aaron to somebody who exhibits the same behavior as Aaron does, but doesn't have BDPWP in there. And what you want to say is someone who exhibits the exact same behavior but does it accidentally or, habitually or something like that, or because, their parents told them to or the law says they should do it or something, they don't deserve the same moral credit as Aaron does.
Right.
And one way to think about that is if you were if you were to try to, let's call that other person Miletus, which is, I think, the picture of Miletus we're supposed to get in the apology anyway. If you need to rehabilitate Aaron, all you've got to do is get rid of ER. But to rehabilitate Miletus, you've got to get B, P, D, W, and P in there somehow. And so he's a more intractable case than Aaron's supposed to be.
It just depends on what's harder to.
Right. I mean, that's why I was kind of wondering, well, here's two things I was thinking. I was wondering if you really want to do your 10 minus 10, because it seems to me even in Barron's case, if you've got this long string of 25 things that are getting in the way of BDPWP, you've still got BDPWP in there, and so he's better than somebody else who's static,
Right.
but has nothing in there, just plain static, right? He's more just than someone who's, I don't know, empty inside or something like that.
I think that's right. I don't know how to subtract this stuff.
Right.
I don't know whether it makes a difference if the blocking factors are part of a trait or
Yeah.
not. If it's only the bases of traits that are intrinsically valuable or disvaluable, then even if you've got pains and fears and stuff that aren't part of the trait, I don't think they're going to count. You're going to have an ad hoc inclusion of intrinsic value, disvalue on your. So that's why I didn't know how to do the subtraction because of those kind of things.
Right.
I agree with you.
But I mean, it seems the comparison to make is maybe to our intuitions about knowledge versus true belief, especially the way it's described in the Meno, right? What's wrong with being somebody who exhibits the exact same behaviors Aaron does, but doesn't have BPDWP in there? You use the term grounding, it's because there's nothing anchoring that behavior. We have this idea it could change at any minute. It might be a pure accident. Whereas for Aaron, there's something stable that's going to keep him, at least in those few situations, or at least in those, when he's dealing with indigent people and family, going to keep him being just. Whereas with this other person, it looks like it's just, mere coincidence and folly that they're always just in those situations. So.
Right, I agree with all that. I think if there's a problem here, it's that I don't know the details of Miletus too well. Let me just say one quick thing so everyone can rush on. I think that sort of elicits another possible inconsistency in our thinking about character. I've just forgotten it. If there's not an anchor, as you're saying, it seems like the behavior rooting therefrom it isn't really assessable morally. And if there is an anchor, that's the only way to really have a moral root for a moral anchor. We also have these intuitions that with people who are consistently bad over their lives, when they have a sudden change of heart at the last minute, suddenly that moral behavior is more valuable than behavior that was rooted in a stable, good frame of mind. So there's really strange ways we have of thinking about this. I just wanted to point that out. I don't know how to treat those situations.
I come from a cognitive psychology background, and so I'm trying to think how you could have thought of mapping this onto a competence performance distinction. Like classical moral psychology, like for example, Colbert. It's a competence model, and how it accounts for the counterfactuals is that when you're assessing someone's level, you give them a hypothetical case. So the competence is demonstrated by them saying why justification. Competence is the justification, and the performance is the application. So it seems to me that there's a lot in moral psychology that accounts for this distinction. And even Piaget himself accounts for example, Aaron's case by saying he calls it a decalogue, a gap. So you have the competence, but because you grew up in culture X, you don't apply the competence, which is the PTWP. You don't apply it if you grew up in culture X, or if you're in social class Y, or if you were what have you. So you know what I'm saying? It's like there's a way to map this onto the competence performance distinction.
If that's doable, I mean, I'd want to read details about it too. It sounds intriguing. And I'm not familiar with that specific element of his work, but if this is borne out empirically, I'm all the more pleased. Because I think in a lot of cases we do just have Molina's like psychologies, and like a lot of determination of what's going on psychologically just is pencil and paper's counterfactual responses. And there's, as you know, obviously a lot of question about whether there's any like veracity we can glean from such kinds of methods of study. I don't know, but if this stuff if this is shown to track, if empirical work tracks actually what I'm trying to do here, I think that's maybe just a booster of it. Maybe, I mean, at least that this is an empirically plausible way to think about the normative side of character traits.
Yeah, and not only that, but it's a way to map it also.
Yeah.
I mean, this competence performance distinction is a way to map this distinction that between according to the disposition or the state of mind and, you know, how it behaviorally, you know, instantiated.
Right.
I
Sorry.
just thought of it. I mean, it's nothing significant, it's just a way of doing the numbers so that you actually meet the Miletus and the errand of Barron, which is to add points for the BPDWP
Okay.
and add points for the actions that are done. In other words, someone is indigent and family just, not just because of the BPDWP, but because they are acting just as indigence and family,
Okay.
but because of the error.
Plus 5 for this, plus 1 for the behavior. Or
Yeah,
for the counterfactual.
for the actions done, yeah, behavior that follows from it.
Okay.
And then rather than subtracting for the precluding states, the precluding states are just not being added on because of behavior.
Okay.
And that way, Miletus, who doesn't have BDWP, doesn't get any points. He only gets significant points for behavior that happen to be going in the right direction. And someone who's like Barron, who's statically just, actually scores higher in the list, even though he's engaged in action.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. There's different ways I've thought about doing this. I'm not sure exactly. What if no.
BDWP should not be canceled out by anything.
Yeah. Right,
And they should be canceled out by precluding states that preclude behavior.
So Miletus is going to score maybe a 2 here.
Yeah.
He couldn't score any behavioral points because the behavioral points can only be scored when you've got a full state.
I think it was right.
2 out of 10. That's, yeah, I like that. Further questions? Well, good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Where's that show up? I would like to take
It's
you
getting
back.
one way.
No way. That's
There's a bunch of social psychology reading just like in particular about whether character traits are empirically adequate, whether we should have them. So this is what
things.
Yeah.
If I'm like this bubbling pit of hatred.
Yeah.
Because what I was thinking about is sort of intuitive fact, where it's like, okay, the whole theory would be shot down. Yeah, intuitively people with good characters who like to do good things.